Hello everyone, this is Mr. Roseman, and today we're going to take a look at the development of the Ottoman Empire in the early modern era. It is an example of a land-based empire that made extensive use of gunpowder technology, so therefore it is a land-based gunpowder empire. Unlike its Western European counterparts, the Portuguese, Spanish, French, English, and Dutch empires that were maritime based, though they also made extensive use of gunpowder technology to help in their expansion. The Ottoman Empire is perhaps best compared with the Russian Empire, a fellow land based gunpowder empire of the early modern era. Both the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire will extend well into the modern era, so we will be discussing both of them for quite some time in our course. Before we go any further in looking at specifically the Ottoman Empire, we need to place the development of the Ottoman Empire, but also its counterparts of the Safavid Empire and the Mughal Empire in historical context, and that requires us to take a look back towards the end of the post-classical era. I'm going to show you a map here of the general area where we see these three Islamic gunpowder empires, the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals. So here you can see that they fill a large area within Dar al-Islam. So you should be able to identify Dar al-Islam as those areas within that purple line surrounding areas of Afro-Eurasia. So extending all the way to Southeast Asia, South Asia, of course the Middle East, even into Eastern Europe, North Africa, and areas of Sub-Saharan Africa. So that's the world of Dar al-Islam by around 1450. When it comes to the development of the Ottoman Empire, Safavid Empire, and Mughal Empire, again, all three of which are Islamic land-based gunpowder empires of the early modern era, they all had several traits in common with one another. For one, they all developed as a result of the expansion of Turkic nomads. So we have talked briefly about Turkic peoples before as nomads. The last time we discussed them, they became, some of them, many of them, became allies to the Mongol Empire. And that's in part what led the Turkic peoples to expand into areas of the Middle East and South Asia. As the Mongol Empire collapsed in the 1300s, and the Khanates began to fall apart, Turkic peoples saw their opportunity to fill a political vacuum in the Middle East and also take advantage of the opportunity to expand into South Asia. And as these different Turkic groups expanded, they wound up establishing new empires, of which include the Ottoman Turk Empire, the Safavid Empire, and the Mughal Empire. So their elite leadership positions, they all trace their origins back to these Turkic peoples. As they expanded and in their interaction at the end of the post-classical era with the Mongols, that's when they adopted gunpowder technology. And so as the Mongols retreated, their adoption of gunpowder technologies allowed them to quickly move in and develop and assert their power and influence within those areas of the Middle East and South Asia. So a key aspect of these civilizations, once again, is the development and reliance of their armies on guns, including artillery like cannons, and hence, therefore, they are these gunpowder empires, very much like the Russian Empire and those other Western imperial states that I mentioned before. So that's what gives these powers their initial strength, is their adoption of gunpowder technology and exploiting the weaknesses left behind as the Mongols retreated at the end of the post-classical era. So let's take a look specifically at the Ottomans, how they fit into that context. So once again, they all began, or the Ottomans began as a Turkic people. So they spoke Turkic languages, not Arabic. And though they began as semi-nomadic people, living in essentially originally a horse culture, very much like the Mongols, as they moved into the Middle East with the Mongol retreat, they adopted a sedentary lifestyle and converted to Sunni Islam, almost exclusively Sunni Islam, these Ottoman Turks. And so therefore, as they established their empire, along with their Sunni Islamic conversion, they will also adopt that animosity towards Shia Muslims, and we'll see that as they interact with the Safavid Empire. Nonetheless, another factor that allowed these Ottomans to expand early on, in particular under the leadership of Osman, which the Ottomans are named for, their Sultan Osman, was the fact that the Byzantine Empire was still hanging on barely. And using their gunpowder technology, they're basically going to roll over the remaining bits of the Byzantine Empire. So using their gunpowder weapons, firearms, cannons, such as this one here, is massive cannons, they have that edge over those states that lack them, especially that Byzantine Empire. So therefore, one of the early sultans of the Ottoman Empire, a ruler named Mehmed, is going to conquer the Byzantine Empire by using this gunpowder technology to basically blast down the walls of Constantinople. And that will be the very end of the Byzantine Empire as of 1453. So keep in mind, always associate the Ottoman empires at their peak of power when they're making war. So they are best and they're strongest whenever they are expanding overland using their gunpowder technology. When they reach their farthest limits of their empire, that's when things start to turn shaky, it seems. But we're going to hold off on that for a while. We want to look at the Ottomans at their peak of power. And this is best seen under Mehmed II, Sultan Mehmed II, and also one of his successors, Suleiman, known as the Magnificent. Anyhow, 1453, using that gunpowder technology, their massive cannons, they blasted down the triple walls of Constantinople, what had basically made them invincible up to this point. And under Mehmed's leadership, the Ottoman Turk armies march into Constantinople and declare it the new key city for this expanding Ottoman Empire. So with 1453, end of Constantinople, there is no more Byzantine Empire, a critical change in terms of state organization leadership in this part of the world. That means also, with no more Byzantine Empire, Western Europe is directly up against an Islamic state. There is no buffer in between, and that's going to make the Western Europeans particularly uneasy, knowing their past relationship with Islamic states. Nonetheless, going back to the conquest of Constantinople, Constantinople is going to be renamed by the Turks as the city of Istanbul, which I believe means the great city or the city. Not a lot of creativity there, but because of Constantinople's importance politically, but also economically, it becomes the center of the Ottoman state itself. So the sultans of the Ottoman Empire, they're going to locate their key palace here in Istanbul, formerly Constantinople, what becomes known as the Palace of Topkapi, or Topkapi Palace. And from there, at Istanbul, they will regulate trade meeting between the Mediterranean and Black Sea. So basically, Istanbul, formerly Constantinople, is the gateway between these two bodies of water, and therefore they are in a perfect position, just as the Byzantines were, to control and tax trade moving between those sea routes. But they're also at the end or beginning, if you want to see it that way, of the Great Silk Roads that expands overland across Asia. All right, so with the expansion of the Ottomans to include what formerly was Constantinople, now Istanbul, they made further gains now in southeastern Europe, what's known as the Balkans. And that is this area right here in southeastern Europe. In addition, they will go on to expand into the territory that is Greece. So this is not just an Asian empire, it's also going to be an empire that expands into Europe, but also into North Africa. So this is a massive state basically controlling territory that was formerly Byzantine lands and Caliphate lands from the post-classical era. Because they have a foothold on the Mediterranean, they begin developing a large navy that's going to dominate most of the eastern Mediterranean and even threatens Italy. As a result of that, Venice is going to, as a city-state, enters into a trade partnership in a way because they kind of were bullied by the Ottoman Empire, but they also gained major benefits from that a trade relationship with the Ottomans, as we'll see soon. But by the 1500s, the Ottomans, using their gunpowder technology, they had conquered pretty much the entirety of the Middle East, with the exception of what becomes the Safavid Empire, and almost all of North Africa, so expanding almost all the way through to Morocco. Now, with such a large empire, it makes sense that we would expect to see a strong centralized government, and that's exactly what we see, like what exists in so many other gunpowder-based empires, whether maritime or land-based. Heading the Ottoman political system is the Sultan, and he is very much like the caliphs of the Umayyad and the Abbasid caliphates. So he claims absolute leadership, total unlimited rule, and he also sees himself and expects to be treated as the god for the Islamic faith, so in a position of the caliph. So there was nothing restricting his power, and just like we see in absolute monarchies in Western Europe, in Russia, in the Russian Empire, and the Chinese empires, we will see claims of divine right. Not divinity, but divine right. So in this case, claiming the right to leadership from Allah himself. Perhaps the best example of an absolute monarch for the Ottoman Empire is Suleiman the Magnificent, and he ruled at the peak, absolute peak of Ottoman power. So under Suleiman, just like these other early sultans, they claimed total political and military and religious authority, and so that reinforced and legitimated their power over the state. Suleiman the Magnificent, perhaps, though, is the best example of an absolute monarch for the Ottomans because of so much territory that he himself conquered, in particular those moves that headed towards Western Europe. By 1529, he had conquered the state of Hungary in Eastern Europe and several times threatened Vienna, laid siege to Vienna in Austria. Even though the Europeans were able to hold them off from that point on through this era, the Ottomans are seen as a real absolute threat to the Western Europeans. And that's all happening while the Western Europeans are basically turned against one another, fighting religious wars and wars over expansion overseas. So those are major problems the Western Europeans are going to have to deal with. But in the meantime, Suleiman the Magnificent leads the Ottoman Empire at its peak of power and peak of expansion this early modern period. Now, assisting the Sultan with his absolute power is, of course, a vast bureaucracy. We pretty much always see bureaucracies with strong centralized governments. Never not associate that with centralized government. But again, like we saw with caliphs, the Sultan is just one man. He needs assistance in ruling and making choices, decisions for his empire. So assisting him and serving as his chief advisor and chief bureaucrat or chief administrator is a person named the vizier. And he oversees a vast bureaucracy that was largely recruited through a system called devshirme. Now, in the textbook that you were to have read in the Stearns textbook, devshirme is never mentioned. However, this is a key term you need to know, devshirme, or devshirme. What this was a system for recruiting able-bodied men to become elite soldiers for the Ottomans and also bureaucrats. So again, devshirme is a recruitment system used by the Ottoman sultans to gain well-qualified soldiers and bureaucrats. So, let me try to explain devshirme a little bit more. So as the Ottoman Empire expanded in the 1400s into the Balkans, again, southeastern Europe, this is a territory that was heavily influenced by the Byzantines, so therefore religiously, the population was primarily Orthodox Christian. So as the Ottoman state expanded into that territory, they saw the local population, in particular peasant Orthodox Christians, as a potential source for slaves. slaves that the Sultan could use to serve as his military and bureaucrats. So, fellow Ottoman bureaucrats, representatives of the Sultan, would be sent into villages throughout the Balkans and would essentially pay parents for their young boys that ranged from age 8 all the way up to their to about age 20 or so. A lot of peasant families, honestly, were not too put off by this idea. Some of them needed quick cash, realized they could not afford all the children that they had, so willingly sold their sons into slavery to the Sultan. So this is that process of devshirme. Again, recruitment system for soldiers and bureaucrats from the Balkans. And what would happen is that these boys under devshirme, they would be sent back to Istanbul, and they would be trained. They would be trained in the arts, in literacy, in military training, and a selection process would begin in which those boys, who were also, by the way, converted to Sunni Islam and would remain slaves of the Sultan, they would be raised as elites. And over time, through a system of oversight by the government, these boys, becoming men, would be guided towards either becoming soldiers or a warrior aristocracy known as the Janissaries. These are a key group of slaves. They are warrior aristocrats that are essentially slaves in background. They remain slaves to the Sultan until the day they die. Yet, they were the elites. They were the only ones in the Ottoman Empire allowed to own and use gunpowder weaponry. So as the Ottoman Empire expands, it's these Janissaries that are the loyal soldiers of the Sultan and leading that Ottoman expansion. Boys that were not so great at fighting, at military skill, but were qualified in terms, or better qualified in terms of literacy and writing, usually they would head down a path towards bureaucrats, pencil pushers for the imperial state, still an elite status and still slaves to the Sultan, but loyal. So here's an example of a Janissary soldier here holding his large oversized gun. But these are the people, again, that are these military slaves, and that's nothing new for the Islamic world. So this continues a trend that we saw beginning with the earlier caliphates of the post-classical era. If you recall the Mamluks, they're essentially the same as that, except for this idea that these men are slaves, but they are equipped with gunpowder weaponry and remain loyal to the Sultan, at least for about 2 centuries or so. All right. Over time, though, these Janissaries, these slave warrior aristocrats equipped with gunpowder weapons, they started to gain quite a bit of influence on sultans. Sometimes they would rise in coups against the sultans and tried to rule by those means. Nonetheless, devshirme, Janissaries, and this is really important, this is an example of slavery that actually resulted in upward mobility. So not all forms of slavery are created equal. This is in stark contrast to what we see happening in the Americas with chattel slavery and Africans being employed to being used to work in sugar plantations, or even coerced labor systems like serfdom. To be a Janissary, that was elite. That was to become an elite, a well-respected, well-regarded person in the Ottoman state. All right, so using these Janissaries, we see constant expansion through about the mid-1600s or so, including first against the Byzantines with the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, moving towards Hungary under Suleiman the Magnificent, and eventually to Vienna, where they reached their farthest extent in their westward expansion. And at the same time, also coming into conflict with their neighboring Islamic state, the Safavid Empire, in particular at a battle called the Battle of Calderon. More on that in a few moments. We also see expansion and conflict with the Russian Empire, in particular as the Russian Empire sought warm water ports, first along the Black Sea. So we'll see growing tensions between the Russian Empire and the Ottomans over the same types of resources. Okay, so the next thing we need to consider is that, like caliphates before them, and like so many other gunpowder empires, land-based or maritime empires, this is a multicultural empire. It was not just Turks. So Turks are ruling the Ottoman Empire. They are a minority, however. The vast majority of Ottomans are Arabs, and you may not be aware of it, but there are lots of different groups of Arabs, including Palestinian Arabs, Iraqi Arabs, Lebanese Arabs, Syrian Arabs. There are also other smaller ethnic groups, such as Armenians, Kurds, Slavs, and Greeks, that all compose the population of the Ottoman Empire. So non-Turks, the vast majority of their population, they actually resent the Turks as time progresses, where leadership starts to get less in quality, higher taxes are charged upon the population. But eventually the non-Turks will come to resent Ottoman Turkish control, seeing them as a minority population controlling the majority non-Turkic peoples. But in the meantime, all right, for most of the early modern era, the population of this multicultural empire is Sunni Muslim. The vast majority are Sunni Muslim, but there are smaller populations of Jews and Christians. And just like we saw in the earlier caliphates, the Jews and Christians were seen as dhimmis. The Ottoman Turks took the idea of jizya, they adopted that for themselves, and therefore they carried out a practice of religious tolerance, charging jizya or a head tax on non-Muslims. And in this way, the Jewish and Christian populations, in particular those that were merchants, actually thrived, and that added to the complexity and success of this state through much of the early modern era. Ironically enough, even though this is a Muslim state, when it comes to religious differences, those they had the greatest conflict with were fellow Muslims, in particular those who were Shiites, both Shiites within their empire, but also their next door neighbors, again, the Safavid Empire, which was a Shia Muslim state. This is a good example of continued Sunni-Shia conflict. This Battle of Calderon fought between the Ottoman Turks and the Safavid Empire, which was fought in 1514. This was a battle that was fought in the view of the Ottomans as an attempt to expand into Persia, what is today Iran. And it also is historically significant because it demonstrated the power of gunpowder technology, especially cannons that could be moved quickly on the battlefield. So what happened at the Battle of Calderon was that Janissaries, with their firearms, including the large cannons, actually took on the Safavid cavalry and just handed them a swift, clear defeat. So whereas the Safavids attacked with traditional nomadic-style attacks, even though they had at that time become sedentary, it showed the strength of gunpowder against a cavalry charge. Nonetheless, this is a demonstration, another example of military or gunpowder technology aiding in the expansion of a land-based imperial state. All right, the last thing I wanted to take a look at are the economic systems and developments within this Ottoman Empire. So with a strong centralized government, a military that's backed with gunpowder technology, and a navy out in the Mediterranean, as well as a smaller navy in the Indian Ocean trade network, the conquest of the Ottoman Empire actually energized and strengthened trade. So as the empire expanded across North Africa, that meant they had direct access to the Trans-Saharan trade network. That meant an influx of slaves and gold. When it comes to their expansion across the Middle East, that meant that they had direct access to the Great Silk Road in the Indian Ocean sea lanes. That brought in luxury goods as well, not just for their own demands, but also to sell on to Europeans who also, during this era, as we know, had a growing taste for those Asian luxuries coming in from places like India and China. So silk, porcelain, spices, cotton cloth coming through the Great Silk Road and the Indian Ocean sea lanes, that strengthened the vitality of this Ottoman imperial state. And with their direct access as well to the Mediterranean and their use of a navy to patrol the eastern Mediterranean, and with their trade partnership with Venice, the Ottomans are able to control the flow of Asian goods coming from the Silk Roads into the Mediterranean. And that was also a boost to Venice in the short term, because those are goods that they would buy from the Ottomans and then sell on to other Western Europeans. But here's where we make connections to where we've come so far in the early modern era and looking at other topics. So how did all of this impact Portugal and Spain over on the Atlantic seaboard of Western Europe? So what you should remember is that with the expansion of the Ottomans and their trade relationship with Venice, they pretty much have overland trade through the Silk routes into the Mediterranean tied up. They charge large quantities of money for access to those Asian luxury goods. So Portugal and eventually Spain, not long after, by the mid to late 1400s, they are looking for alternate routes to Asia to bypass the Ottomans and the Venetians and this general Mediterranean and Silk route trade. So that prompts maritime exploration and the eventual creation of maritime empires by Western European states, with first the Portuguese Empire and the Spanish Empire. So hopefully you can see how this is all feeding into larger events, larger context for the era. Nonetheless, even though Portugal does eventually develop sea routes to Asia, particularly to India by 1498, starting with Vasco da Gama, all right, and then continued trade with Asia, the Ottoman Empire remains a key destination for trade. They're able to produce highly prized goods themselves through guild productions, producing things like rugs and cloth, ceramics, even miniature paintings that we'll examine in class pretty soon. But because of its crossroads nature of trade, here on the Silk routes, Mediterranean, and the Black Sea, Istanbul is still a destination for merchants. This is a multicultural, cosmopolitan city. And because there's still a demand for luxury goods, and they have connections to global trade because of their ties to Western Europe, there's an influx of silver into the Ottoman Empire to buy those luxury goods. So you need to think about those long-term impacts on the Ottoman economy. For one, we know that the imperial governments of these states in Asia, they're going to use that silver to expand their states themselves, to buy more, produce more guns and cannons, to increase the quality of their leaders' livelihoods, living in greater luxury. But it also allows them to build on an enormous scale, one of which was the Suleimani Mosque. And if you take a look here at the Suleimani Mosque, try to remember what this was probably inspired by from the Byzantine Empire. And if you said the Hagia Sophia, you're thinking of the Hagia Sophia, that church that was built by Justinian back in the 500 CE, you're exactly right. This becomes the style of most Ottoman mosques throughout the empire. So we'll see traditions of architecture of the Byzantine Empire expand and continue through now a new imperial state, but the influx of silver helped to fund the construction projects like this that demonstrated the power and the might of the Ottoman state. Also, we see in the long term, because of too much money flowing into the Ottoman Empire eventually, inflation also eventually hits, which will hurt their economy in the long term. But in the meantime, this is a dynamic empire that is going to come into contact extensively with Europeans and has its strength because of its exceptional use of gunpowder technology to expend, oftentimes at the expense of its neighbors.